So we have with us tonight CJ Frederick, author, originally born and raised Glencoe area, currently out Tilsonburg way. She's got her most recent book, Rooted and Remembered, which will be available if you'd like a copy afterwards tonight. Chatting with CJ, setting this presentation up, she had a number of topics, and there's a meeting going on next month with a different topic in Glencoe, and I believe something coming up with the museum as well. So I'm sure you'd be welcome to attend either of those if that's something you're interested in. So CJ's right up. We have come to think of horsepower as it relates to a mechanical engine's capacity for work or speed. Its origins, of course, date back to actual equines, made of muscle and heart. Nowhere did we need horsepower more than in the muddy fields of Europe in the First World War. Millions of horses served and died there. CJ Frederick has had two passions in life, riding and horses. In her novel, Rooted and Remembered, she retells the local story set around the time of the Great War. And given her love of horses, she made sure to include not just the soldiers and those left behind at the home front, but also the horses collected from all across the farms and fields of the UK and its colonies and allies. The war horses lived and died in atrocious conditions, but without horsepower, the Allied forces would not have won the war. So, having said that, welcome CJ to our group.
Thank you for the introduction, Chad. I appreciate that. As Chad mentioned, my name is CJ Frederick, and I'm honored to be attending your meeting tonight and to present to you a passion of mine, horses and riding. I'm going to share with you the journey of how I became a published author. The story I wrote is a piece of local historical fiction. It takes place in a location not too far from here. And tonight I'm going to talk about a thread that runs through my story. It's the connection between people and horses. As Chad mentioned, we've come to think of horsepower as an engine, right? So I'm sure everybody here knows that horsepower is actually powered by an actual horse that has a muscle and a heart. And nowhere did we need horsepower more than during World War I in the muddy fields of Europe. So let's talk about war horses. This is our pony Dakota, by the way, with the dandelion in her mouth. I think she's pretty cute. So I'd like to start out just with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations. I acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral peoples. I give thanks to the people, animals, and plants of Turtle Island, whose presence has afforded me the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And I give thanks to the abundance and beauty of the land that we and Dakota stands on. And there I am. Delighted to be here tonight. That's my photo. I'm a local girl, born and bred in Middlesex County. I was born in London, Ontario. I grew up in Glencoe, Ontario, and I actually attended my final year of high school at Strathroy District Collegiate Institute, but not the one there. It was the old one. I know, it was nicer, wasn't it?
I think so.
So just to prove that I know who I am and where I'm from, Strathroy, Glencoe, and the dot, the pin on the map is Kilmartin, close to where I was born. Sorry, where I was raised. So what connects me to this presentation? There we go. You're supposed to be very impressed at this point. When I was a small child and I couldn't sleep, my dad would come and sit on the edge of my bed until I fell asleep. And he'd always say to me something like this: "Well, what do you want to talk about?" And I'd say, "Let's talk about horses." And he'd say, "Horses are nice." And that happened hundreds of times, didn't it, Dad? No.
Yeah.
When we went on road trips as a family, I was the kid who was sitting in the back seat of the car, and I'd get excited and point out the window, "There's a horse there," and we'd have to keep count of how many horses we had, and I knew all the roads and stuff like that where the horses lived. This is actually a drawing that I drew of a horse that I used to beg to go ride at Circle R Ranch in Delaware. We didn't have a lot of extra money, but I would beg my mom. I think it cost $15 to go for a trail ride. And I always wanted to ride a certain little pony named Acorn. And he was a little bay horse, and that's the photo that I drew of him when I was a kid. But in 1981, my dreams came true. We moved from London, Ontario, into a small hobby farm near Kilmartin, close to Glencoe. And I was told that I could finally get a horse of my own. And I just thought I was on top of the world. And this is my very first horse. Her name is Ruthie. She was a standard bred. I don't know if you know standard breds, but they're the trotter horses. Trotters or pacers. So Ruthie was a little ex-racing standard bred. She was the sweetest little horse. All of my fondest childhood memories are of riding on trails and gravel roads around Mosa Township with Ruthie. She was best friend. Me in the present day with my current horse, and her name is Minzy. And she's also a standard bred. I seem to have a thing going with standard breds. She is the best listener, and she loves carrots, and she loves back scratches. So that was me setting up who I am and my credentials. I have always loved horses. I've always dreamed about horses. I still have horses, and I will always love them. Next slide, please. So let's get to World War I and horses. Why did any of what I've just gone through, including the absent photos, matter at all? So in addition to being a horse lover, I'm also a writer. I've always loved to write. When I was a kid, I had to take an hour-long bus ride every day, and I'd write little stories or poems on the bus just to pass the time. And as an adult, I've worked as a technical writer, which is kind of boring business stories. So at the start of the pandemic, I decided to take the leap into more creative writing. And I decided to write what I thought was a short story, but it ended up being a novel. And it's set around the years of World War I. So I ended up doing a lot of research about World War I in writing that to find out what it was like for people during that time. And inevitably, I learned that it was a brutal conflict for people, but also for all of the animals that were there. And I couldn't look past that because I'm an animal lover at heart. Next slide, please. So another part of my credential is that I'm the proud granddaughter of a World War I veteran. My grandfather is seated in this photo, and this is a photo that we were given by a distant relative. We didn't even know it existed. And that's my grandfather with his first cousin. He served in the 162nd Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and his rank was driver. Next slide, please. He was a driver, not of vehicles, but of horses. It's in my blood, I think, my connection to horses. I've heard that if there's a genetic link, that if you love horses, it's actually something that goes through your DNA, and I'm sure that I inherited that. So that's my grandfather's discharge papers. He survived, obviously, the World War, or else I wouldn't be here. So he was discharged in May of 2019. Yep, Powassan. Yep.
That was his home in Powassan?
Yeah, that's where he lived. You have very good eyes. Next slide, please. So, all of the historical photos that I'm about to show you, I don't have ownership of them, but they are historical, they're old, so the copyright has expired on them. I don't own any of the images, but I found them through web searches. Next slide, please. World War I marked a change in warfare. It started out as a conflict where cavalries, which are mounted soldiers, were widely used. This is a photo of the British cavalry. You can see the officers mounted on their horses, and they have bedrolls and weapons intact. Next slide, please. This is a British recruitment poster, and it advertises the need for men who are thoroughly accustomed to horses. Sounds really important, doesn't it? please. This is an early American recruitment poster, and it emphasized again the cavalry to build excitement and interest among the recruits. They used the allure of equitation to get volunteers. And this one says, "The horse is man's noblest companion. Join the cavalry and have a courageous friend." Looks noble, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Next. Here's another one from the American Army. "Forward to victory, enlist now." It's exciting, doesn't it? These images didn't fit the reality, not what I've discovered. The changes in weapons of war made people and horses especially vulnerable. The cavalry was quickly mowed down by new weapons, machine gun fire, artillery, and poisonous gas. And despite the changes in weaponry and tactics, horses were still very valuable in the conflict, and they were in high demand. They used them to transport supplies, carry messages, and transport injured people. So in this photo, we see a team of horses that are transporting supplies. They don't really look like cavalry horses though, do they? This is another photo of horses transporting supplies. Slide, please. So how many horses served in World War I? Let's talk about the numbers. Because we're being specific, next slide, please. I want to pay homage to all equines. It was not just horses that we're talking about. There were also mules and donkeys that also served. And interestingly enough, the United States was the main supplier of the mule population. That's where most of the mules in World War I came from. So horses were widely used, but donkeys and mules were also there. So it's estimated that 6 to 8 million horses served in World War I. Does that surprise you?
Yeah.
Yeah, it surprised the heck out of me too. And those were estimates. It's not like someone was sitting, writing down the numbers and making sure that, Gentle Joe was signed up and Gentle Joe died. They don't know exact numbers, but an estimate is 6 to 8 million horses served.
Would that be both sides?
I think so, yeah. He asked if it was both sides, I believe so. So that's equivalent to the population of Denmark in horses. Does that surprise you? That surprised me. It's difficult to know the estimates, but most say that between 6 and 8 million horses served. And here are the top 5 countries that I could find when I was looking. Canada contributed 130,000 of its horses. Britain contributed 1 million horses. Australia and New Zealand contributed 120,000. And the USA, as I mentioned, who supplied most of the mules, contributed 1 million. And then I found a statistic that lumped in Germany, Russia, and France together as having provided 3 million. It's pretty high, huh? So how did they acquire so many horses? At the start of the war, the United Kingdom had only 38,000 horses in its forces. And they realized very quickly that we need a lot more. You can go to the next slide. They procured them through sales. This gentleman was telling me here at the break that his great-grandfather had to give up his horses from his farm in Wales. Very common. They were purchased at sales. Farmers were encouraged to bring their horses to round up sales. And the Crown forced farmers at one point to sell their horses, and they said they gave them fair market value, but I don't know if that is, I don't know how you can value a fair market when the horse is basically your livelihood on a farm. So any horses that were not required for transportation or agriculture were basically forced to be sold to the army. And because Britain relied on horses in the 1910s for farming, they depleted their horse population almost immediately, and then they turned to their allies in the colonies to contribute their horses. And eventually, they turned to conscription. That's the word I'm going to use for it. They basically said that horses had to serve because they were running out of horses so quickly. It was a time of emergency, and it was a person's loyal duty to offer their horses for the war effort. This broke my heart. This is a letter from a British child begging Lord Kitchener not to take her pony. The Crown in the letter replies that they won't take children's ponies. Now, you might think, oh, the Crown is being so nice, but the reason they didn't want ponies is because they weren't the correct height that they were looking for. Trust me that if ponies were needed, ponies would have been taken and the little girl would have had to give up her pony. They were looking for a very specific type of horse at one point. They were looking for large horses, so 15 hands plus, and if anybody knows what a hand is, not this hand, but a hand is 4 inches. 15 hands is a medium-sized horse, so it does exclude ponies. They were looking for young horses, healthy horses. They were looking for certain breeds of horses, Clydesdales and heavy drafts, and also the light draft horses. So those were the ones that were rounded up. How did they get the horses to Europe? I can't even get my horse in a trailer. And if anybody here has horses, you'll understand that they can be a bit claustrophobic, and loading them can be difficult. But getting them to the battlefield was basically a logistical nightmare. Horses are not the best travelers at the best of time. And think of the scale of the numbers that we're talking about. They had hundreds of thousands of animals to move a long distance. Next slide. Can you believe that they hoisted horses onto ships? They were already using ships to transport men, so they used up the hold of the ship to cram in horses in the hold of the ship. Horses are, like I said, are not great travelers. A lot of them were injured during transportation. A lot of them got sick. A lot of them died just getting to the battlefield. Horses were, once they arrived in Europe, their travels weren't over. They still had to load them onto trains. Again, if you know horses, a lot of them prefer to step up into a trailer. Here they're using a ramp and seem to be doing it quite successfully. It's pretty incredible that they were able to do this. I don't know how they were able to accomplish it, probably through force. I read that 500 to 1,000 horses were shipped to Europe every single day during this conflict. That's how much it averaged out to. Does that surprise you? It's a lot. And I also read that the Germans were using biological warfare, as you know, poisonous gas, but they also realized that the British forces were relying very heavily on horses, so they started to use biological warfare against the horses that were being transported, and they used anthrax, which is a biological weapon, to try to destroy the horses. So the conditions were not exactly ideal. So we're going to talk a bit about the conditions that both the men, mostly men, and the horses faced. And if you're a horse lover, I'm telling you right now, you might want to close your eyes, and Patrick, my husband, he's a big horse lover, and he's actually going to put on a mask because he can't stand to look at these pictures.
I've seen some of them. I don't do well with some.
Oh, trigger warning. Okay, so a lot of these images are very upsetting. I don't even think you have to be a horse lover to be upset by these. You just have to have a heart. Okay. So remember those really exciting recruitment posters we were looking at? Come join the cavalry. So things changed quickly, and the tone changed in the posters. The recruitment posters took a turn. You can see the switch in the message with this one. It says, "Help the horses, save the soldier. Please join the Red Stars." And this shows carnage taking place. There's a horse down on the road, and they're pleading for people to take care of the horses, which they knew were so valuable to them. It was the way that motorized vehicles did not work, basically, in World War I. They relied on horsepower to move stuff around, so they needed them. Next. And with so many horses serving, the armies assembled a massive workforce. to treat injured and sick horses. So they had a mobile veterinary corps, which is pretty incredible. What do you notice about the one horse in this picture?
Tail.
Right, it's a heavy draft horse. So they've already switched the message from cavalry or riding horses into heavy horses. So it's a subtle change in message, right? Those are the ones that they're relying on. Those are the ones that are needing treatment at this point. The war horses were so valuable to the war effort that they set up, as I said, mobile veterinary corps. And it's reported that on one day in 1917, 120,000 horses received treatment. Not all fatal, some were treated and able to be brought back to service, but 120,000 in one day. So the conditions were absolutely brutal. Heavy machinery. I don't know if you want to write slide.
Sorry, there was no slide there.
Oh, okay, yeah. Maybe it's best if you can sit down. This is a photo that I found of a team of horses killed by mortar shells or artillery. That's what happened. Next slide. And did we talk about the mud? Okay. Many horses got stuck in deep holes, and these weren't just holes that happened to be there, it's because there was artillery shell bombs going off, and they would create huge divots, huge, massive divots that would fill up with water. A lot of horses drowned when they were in this condition, and the Army was told that if a horse is at risk of drowning, shoot it instead, right? Because they tried to pull them out, but if they couldn't pull them out, I don't know if you can see in this photo, but there is I think it's a mule that's trying to be pulled out of this photo, but they're not able to do it. And I'm saying mud, but spoiler alert, it's not really mud. It's not just mud, right? It's feces, it's urine, animal and human. It's bacteria. It's absolutely disgusting what they're walking through in horses and humans. Staph infections would be very common. The conditions were just simply appalling. Next slide, please. So with weapons of war, they actually realized that the Germans were using poisonous gas, and to save some of the horses, they developed gas masks that they would put on horses if they knew that an attack was coming. So the soldier was told to put his mask on first and then put it on his horse. It's like when you're in an airplane, you're supposed to help the person who's not able to help themselves after you help yourself first. And that's a picture of a horse and a soldier with a gas mask. So we talked about the mud. That's some mud, huh? If you've had horses, you'll know that grooming is an important part of keeping them. And it keeps them healthy, it keeps them happy, it's good for their health, it's essential for their health. Any horse that's in work has to be groomed. This is the type of grooming, the type of mud that would be on the equines in World War I. It's a huge thick coating. Thanks. A huge thick coating of mud. They had to take care of their feet. Now, human soldiers also got something called trench foot from having feet that were wet all the time, but the horses got something similar. Very, very difficult to keep horses in good condition in this environment. Next slide. The British Army gave out this manual to drivers and gunners for how to take care of the horses that were left in their charge. And it's called the Management and Care of Horses and Harness. And it's a how-to guide in difficult conditions. So if you were starting out with horses today, you wouldn't have to follow these guidelines because you wouldn't have mud that was so thick and coated on your horse. So next slide. On the opening page, it states that horses should be hard and fit and free from galls, cracked keels, sore withers, and backs. And they definitely expected that the soldiers were to spend a significant amount of time caring for the horses in their charge to ensure that their grooming and fitness was kept up so that they could keep working. And as you know, any machine needs fuel to work. So in in this war, horses were engines, they required fuel, but they were doing so much work with not enough food that a lot of them actually just died of exhaustion while they were still harnessed. So this is a picture of a man, two soldiers whose team has just collapsed and has died from exhaustion. And you can see the one soldier being comforted by the other at the loss of what had become his friends. So as the war dragged on, forage, hay, grass became less and less available to the horses. Horses require about 10 times in feed what a human soldier does. So exhaustion was becoming something that they had to cope with, and the conditions were just truly, truly exhausting for the horses. So in many cases, the horses died from exhaustion. Yeah. So in the cold months, it's not just that it was exhausting for them, but it was also a danger of dying of exposure. I don't think they had many horse blankets lying around for the horses that were serving, so a lot of horses ended up dying just of exposure to the elements. The term shell shock, are you familiar with that term? Yeah. It originated in World War I, and it was used to describe what we now know as something called post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. In humans, it showed up with symptoms of tinnitus, amnesia, headaches, dizziness, tremors, and hypersensitivity to noise. And the soldiers, known as deserters, were probably people who had PTSD. But veterinarians also noticed something interesting. They noticed that the jumpiness and stress reactions that they saw in men were also common in horses. They didn't call it PTSD, but it was very similar to that. And it's reported that a lot of soldiers found comfort among the horses that they worked with. They became attached to them, and they worked with them, and they sought solace from them. And this is a picture of a soldier in a rest period, resting alongside his horse. They truly did care for them the best they could. And I read a lot of letters online from soldiers writing home, and a lot of them would mention the horses. Okay. So how many horses died in World War I? Unfortunately, we don't really know the real answer. And to be honest, I don't know if we want to know the real answer. We just know that it was carnage. So 6 to 8 million horses served, and I read that an estimated 60,000 horses remained at the end of the conflict. So that's only a fraction, right? So another statistic I read was that 6 to 8 million served, and 6 to 8 million died. Okay? This letter to the editor is from a man in Ottawa. He was writing about his father's memories of the war and the horses he served with. And I'm just going to read a part of it. So he's mentioning that his father served in France, and how important the horses were to move equipment rapidly across country to positions behind the front line. Next, please. My father rarely spoke about the war, but when he did, he always included references to the horses. And when I consider the death and mutilation of the troops, my mind cannot help but immediately turn to the carnage suffered also by the horses. It's hard to look at photos like these. These are the after photos. Heaps of horses loaded onto wagons. Next. And then tossed into mass graves. Millions upon millions of horses. So what happened to the horses? What did they die from? Starvation and exhaustion were the top two causes of death. So they worked hard and they died. And then number 3 was artillery, shells, and gunfire. So mostly they were dying from the load of work that they were doing and their acceptance to do the work that people asked of them. Does anyone know what kind of breed of horse this is? Do you have any horsey people out? This is a Cleveland Bay horse. It's a light draft horse, and they were highly, highly sought out for World War I. And at the end of the war, there were not very many of them left, and this breed nearly disappeared from the planet. They were almost annihilated during World War I, and it took an effort to actually build the breeding stock up again. There still aren't very many Cleveland Bays left, but they paid a very heavy price for this. So what happened to the horses that survived? Well, as if everything isn't as bad, sorry, sorry, that's okay. As if it weren't so bad what we looked at, it's pretty bad what we looked at. As if that isn't bad enough, I think this is where the story takes its darkest turn. What happened to the remaining horses when the conflict was over, I think is the cruelest twist of all. Yep. After giving so much service and effort and showing us their true hearts, like I said, they were asked to work so hard and they didn't refuse to do the work. The surviving horses were not welcome back as heroes. They weren't even given their freedom. They didn't even get a retirement. Go to the next one. After the war was over, horses became a liability. As I said, they ate 10 times the amount of a soldier, and they had horses left. And they had hungry people, and they had hungry soldiers. So the military had a problem, and they decided that the solution to their problem was that horses were expensive and difficult to care for. And most were sold at auction to either go and work again or were slaughtered and fed to people. 85,000 horses were slaughtered in France and Belgium alone. 500,000 were sold to France so that they could rebuild back their horse stock. And some were sold at auctions and sent well beyond France. So I read some were sent to Egypt and other places like that. Okay. Of the 120,000 horses sent from Australia, how many do you think made it home? I hear none.
Curry brought his.
One out of 120,000. Not very good odds, eh?
That must be done by very top.
Yes.
Of the military or something.
Yes, that's right. So if a horse were lucky enough to be returned home, it was because it was an officer's horse. It was not, that was the reason that it would be selected to be sent home. They thought that a lot of the horses were diseased, so they didn't want to send a lot of them home. So, next slide. All right, so let's turn our sad hearts to a little bit happier. You can, next slide, you can open your eyes now, Patrick. So monuments to war horses have sprung up all around the world, and I think the sacrifice of them has not gone unnoticed, thank goodness. It's gained momentum in the past, I'd say 30 years, and I'm going to show you a few of the monuments, both formal and informal, that have sprung up. This one is in the United Kingdom. Next slide. This one is the same monument, but I wanted you to see the barbed wire that the horse is standing on top of, so standing on top of no man's land, kind of. Next. This one is in England, I think, and it is horses, but it's also camels and llamas and elephants and dogs. So a lot of animals were used as labor in World War I, and this monument recognizes that, which I thought was quite nice. Next. This one, I think, is in Australia. So it shows a falling horse. Next. This monument is in Belgium. thought was quite artistic. This was just a bench somewhere that someone created, lest we forget, and a soldier with his horse behind him. This one is in the United States. This one touched me deeply, and I wanted to show you a picture of it. It's a farm field in France. 100 plus years after the conflict has ended, people still find horseshoes in this field, and they hang them on this fence, and it's become an informal monument, but it stands. This one is carved from marble in France. Have you seen this one? This one also touches me deeply. This was taken in 1919, so after the conflict, and it's 650 American soldiers who were lined up in a formation from a bird's eye view to show a horse's head to give thanks to the horses that served with them and didn't make it back. Next. Have you heard of Michael Morpurgo's book, War Horse? Yeah. So he also sold the rights to Steven Spielberg, who made the movie War Horse, and it brought a lot of recognition to the sacrifice of horses in World War I. It's a story about Joey, is the horse's name, and he is conscripted. He's basically forced to be sold into the British Army at the start of the war, and has a lot of unfortunate things happen throughout the conflict, but eventually is one of the lucky ones that is going to be sold at auction, but is actually sold back to his owner and sent home. We all know what red poppies mean. The purple poppies, you might see people wearing those on their lapels in November as well. A purple poppy signifies the animal victims of war, and it's a way to give recognition and thanks to the horses, the dogs, the pigeons, the elephants, and every other type of animal that served in World War I. So my tribute to war horses. So as I said, I'm the granddaughter of a World War I veteran. I'm a horse crazy girl and a writer, and when I got my chance to pay tribute to the war horses of World War I seized the moment. I wanted to make sure that I included a scene or two in my new novel about the hell that the horses endured. Next. So my novel is a coming-of-age story about a young orphaned boy who was born in British India, so when India was a British colony. He ends up at a rural farm in Middlesex County, not too far from where we're standing tonight. And it's based on his true story, and it's my retelling of his life. Next. When war broke out, Elwyn volunteered to serve in World War I. So I wanted to make sure that in telling his story, I gave the perspectives not only of the soldiers and those left behind, but also of the horses collected from all across the farms and fields of the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, United States, and so on. The war horses lived and they died in atrocious conditions, but without horsepower, we would not have succeeded in this war. This is a picture of Elwyn on the farm, and he had a particular affinity for the horses that were on the farm. He fell in love with one that was named Old Grey. That was his favorite horse, and in one of the letters that he wrote home, he asks how Old Grey is doing. The next picture is of Elwyn in 1917 in France. Elwyn didn't know anything about farming when he showed up from British India, but he learned about farming and the workhorses that made survival possible, and he took a particular fondness for Old Grey. So I'd like to read you a passage from my book that takes place in France in 1917. I just need to take a turn. So to set the scene, Elwyn is serving. He's been serving for several months at this point. He's tired, he's exhausted. He's become disillusioned with what's going on. He's taking in all of the horror that is around him. rooted and remembered. Some of Elwin's fondest memories of the homestead involved the animals he attended to. As a boy, when he was feeling lonely or sad, he had formed refuge and solace in listening to Old Gray and the other horses munching on hay. When he felt homesick now, he let his mind wander back to the places that had given him the greatest comfort. In the midst of unspeakable carnage and chaos in France, he found himself needing refuge once more. The European battlefield had brought immense suffering not only to the human beings, but also to the animals that served alongside them. Shortly after the war began, Britain had scoured the land for horses to add to its military campaign. Most were workhorses used to pulling a plow or a wagon. Being subjected to constant shell blasts and explosions wore on their nerves, just as it did the men. Elwin felt sorry for the beasts living in the same conditions. Underfed and overworked, the horses and donkeys toiled in impossibly cruel conditions. They were living beings being treated like machinery and then thrown aside and no longer usable. When possible, Elwin liked to walk among the harnessed horses and spend a few moments rubbing their ears and whispering calm words to them. He found scattered moments of peace with the war horses. They reminded him of home. He found himself naming them, even though they usually were nameless. "How are you doing, Daisy girl?" he said as he patted the emaciated chestnut mare on her forehead. Although she was a large draft horse, hard work had whittled her size and her hip bones protruded so that they were sharp points. He called her Daisy because of the white star shape on her forehead that reminded him of the flower. She had been harnessed without respite for months on end and had developed angry, oozing welts on her chest from pulling heavy loads that had become heavier the weaker she became. Elwin knew that Daisy would die from exhaustion shortly. Her hollowed eyes had that telltale look of surrender in them, and after months in the field, he recognized it well among both animals and men. "I'm not going to have this today, so you might as well enjoy it," he said as he reached into his pocket and removed a coveted sugar cube. He had been saving it for his next mug of hot chocolate, but Daisy's eyes reached into his soul. He flattened his hand and offered the horse the sugar cube. She sniffed it gently and then gobbled it up and smacked her lips with satisfaction. Her eyes brightened at the taste of sugar coated with kindness. "I'll bring you one more tomorrow if I can," he said. "You need it more than I do." He patted her velvet nose, and the mare exhaled her warm breath on his hand, which James A. had taught him was a sign of affection from a horse. "You're welcome, Pearl," he said as he turned away and headed back to the trench. The next morning, Elwin grabbed 2 sugar cubes and put one into his tea and stowed the other in his pocket for later in the afternoon. He looked for Daisy, but he could not find her. A younger and fresher looking white gelding was now hitched to the wagon, but Daisy was nowhere in sight. Elwin yelled out to John Brown, one of the drivers, "Hey John, where's that chestnut mare?" "Which one?" he asked. "You know, the one with the white patch on her forehead. She was pulling a wagon loaded with canvas tarps on it yesterday. I saw you working with her." John winced, shook his head, and pointed westward. Elwin saw a mound that could have easily been mistaken for freshly dug earth in the fading light. He breathed in deeply, then exhaled, blinking away some tears that were welling against his will. He walked towards the mound, dreading what he knew he would find. "Oh, Daisy." He kneeled beside her, stroked her patchy chestnut fur, easily feeling her ribs under his fingertips. Her body was still warm, and her brown eyes and her mouth open. He unbuckled her bridle and removed the metal bit from her mouth, placed it on the ground beside her. He wanted to give her her freedom. "I guess you're at peace now. I'll find someone else to give this to," he said as he felt in his pocket for the sugar cube. He placed his fingers on her lids and closed the mare's eyes. "Rest now, Daisy, you worked really hard." As he headed back to the trench, he stopped and patted the white gelding on the muzzle. He felt his nose felt like luxurious velvet to Elwin's now roughened hands. "Hi, snowman," he said gently. He offered his flattened hand, holding the sugar cube to the hungry horse. He felt a mix of sadness and rage boiling in his gut. How many more innocent things would this war destroy, and for what? He could not shake the image of Daisy from his head. He was now thinking about Old Gray and Billy, the foal that he had named after James A. invited him to the stall to see him stand a few minutes after his birth. How he missed them in the simplicity of life back at the homestead. So he did the only thing he could. He took out a piece of paper and began penning a letter to Archie. May 9th, 1917. Archie Carruthers, Glencoe, Ontario. Dear Archie, thank you for the recent note. You're becoming quite the letter writer. I see that your mother has also begun to teach you how to write beautifully as she did I. She made sure I knew how to write perfectly, and I've been able to teach a man here how to write because of the lessons she gave me. How's Fanny? And what about Old Gray? We have a lot of horses here. I've been naming them and giving them sugar cubes whenever I can. I have a favorite named Daisy. She did such a good job helping us that she will soon be sent back because her farmer needs her back. She misses him too. I'll miss her, but I'm happy that she has finally been called home. It's good that you have all the kittens to keep you company. Maybe you could send me some here. We have a lot of rats, and a kitten would prove awfully useful. Take good care. Love, Elwyn. A tear dropped onto the paper, smudging the ink. Archie was too young to understand the truth about Daisy, but Elwyn did believe that she had been called home. I'm scared, Mama, he said, loud enough for the others to overhear him. I hope you're here with me now. Feelings of dread and fear raced up and down his legs, making them feel wobbly and weak. It reminded him of the day he had seen Billy, the foal, first standing a few minutes after being born. He swayed and unsteadied himself. He recalled the conversation that he had with Betsy Jane years ago about fear and courage. She had advised him that it was okay to feel fear, natural in fact, but that courage was present when you were able to put your trust and faith in God. Another tear formed and spilled onto his cheek. I'm afraid, but I'm going to leave my fate in your hands. As he closed his eyes, he saw a vision of a glorious chestnut horse, its coat gleaming in the morning light, racing across a lush pasture. The sound of horse hooves pounding the ground resonated in his ears. You made it home, Daisy. Elwyn has a buttonwood tree dedicated to his memory, and I'd like to think that maybe there are some horses in your backyard. So, this is the part where I'm going to try not to cry. I wanted you to see all the pictures that I had of the horses that I've had. I've had to put several of my horses to sleep over the years. And it's one of the hardest things I've had to do. Such a big and strong, beautiful animal, to see them die is difficult. It is a tradition among horse lovers to cut the horse's tail after it's died and keep it as a souvenir. So I have two horse tails on my office wall at home from both of my horses who I've had to put to sleep. And the saying goes that when a horse arrives at the Rainbow Bridge, that's the place in heaven where animals go, all the other horses can see the ones that arrive without a tail. And here's how the poem goes. The best horses in heaven, they have no tail. This is a rule they all know without fail. For when a new horse arrives with a shortcut bob, they all know that this horse did a very good job. So what I'd like you to do is just close your eyes for a moment. Think about 6 to 8 million horses without tails. because they gave us their hearts. Thank you for listening to me tonight, I really appreciate it, it's been a pleasure.
And thank you, CJ. Do we have any questions? Actually, I'm gonna start with a question. I don't know a lot about horses. I'm not a horse guy. I was not a farmer. I did a little bit of training with the police horses in Toronto, and they scared the crap out of me. Just being near them, they're so big and majestic. And that's about what I know about horses. Do you know, I know dogs are still used in the military today. Are horses still used at all in the military today that you're aware of?
I believe so, the paramilitary for sure, like you said, police forces, but I'm not 100% sure. I am passionate about horses, but I know about that much about them. So if you have specific questions about them, I probably won't know the answer.
I do notice, special forces in Afghanistan used horses.
Hold on one second. Let me get to you with this so we can pick it up here.
I do know that American Special Forces in Afghanistan use horses on an extraction mission. So I guess depending on what the landscape is, horses are still used as a necessary mode of transportation. So definitely, yes, they are still used when needed.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions?
I just have a statement for the.
Hold on one second. Let me get back to you.
One of the Australian movies about Gallipoli or Barracuda, that starts off with horses in a railway carriage, and it says, "These horses are doing their bit to the war. How about you?"
Any further questions? Okay.